Our notes today are about the second major English settlement in the New World, what becomes the English colonies in America. And this time it's up in Massachusetts, up in New England. We're going to be looking at three different parts of the notes as we talk about Massachusetts. And the first part is about the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were the first group to make the move to Massachusetts. But in order to understand who the Pilgrims are, we first have to have an understanding of who the Puritans are. And the Puritans were a group in England that criticized the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is just another name for the Church of England. And they got that nickname, the Puritans, because they wanted to purify the church and get rid of things that they felt were unnecessary. They also believed that each person could read and interpret the Bible for himself. They liked pastors, but they didn't think that you should have to rely on the pastor to read and understand the Bible. Now, the Pilgrims were a smaller group inside of the larger group of Puritans. So they were like a small part of the Puritans. And they were kind of on the extreme end. They wanted to completely separate from the Anglican Church. They didn't just want to purify it. They wanted to completely break away and do their own thing. So in 1620, a group does just that. They get a group together, and they come to Massachusetts on a ship called the Mayflower. Now, the group that came over was not all Pilgrims, and that's going to be important. About half of them were Pilgrims, and about half of them weren't. And that's going to be important because they run into some issues right away, just like the settlers in Jamestown. And they run into some problems that have to be solved immediately. Some of those problems, many of them were sick. They're sick from the voyage over. They weren't doing well. They were supposed to be going to Virginia. They didn't have permission to be in Massachusetts. They got blown off course during their journey. Now, because they were in the wrong place, the people on the Mayflower who were not Pilgrims said, hey, we don't have to listen to the leaders of this voyage anymore. You guys no longer have authority over us because we aren't in Virginia. And it was cold, and winter was coming, and they needed shelter and food and fuel, and they needed it fast. So there were some really big problems they had to solve. To solve this, they wrote up something called the Mayflower Compact. And this is an important term to understand, the Mayflower Compact. What it said was that they would elect representatives to make decisions for the general good of the colony. So just like down in Virginia, they decided to have democracy. They decided to let people vote on who would lead. And everybody agreed to obey the laws. So they would get to vote on who makes the laws, and then everyone agreed to follow the laws. And why is this Mayflower Compact so important? Well, this became the very first written framework of self-government in the American colonies. Yes, the House of Burgesses came first and was the first example of elections in America, but the Mayflower Compact is the first time that the structure of self-government is written down and signed for all to see and follow. And that's going to become a model for the United States. So what about the larger group of Puritans? Well, once Massachusetts gets started, more and more Puritans start coming over. In fact, in about a 10-year span, 20,000 Puritans moved from England to Massachusetts. Well, why? What was so great about Massachusetts? Well, one thing was they weren't very happy with the king in England, and they wanted to get away from England. They wanted to worship God in their own way. They wanted freedom of religion. That's really the driving factor for these Puritans. They're moving to Massachusetts for freedom of religion. And they wanted to be an example for the rest of the world to follow, what they called being a city on a hill. Right? They wanted to prove to the world that you could have a colony where people could exercise their religion and worship how they wanted to and be a model for everyone else to follow. Like in Virginia, the government in Massachusetts was set up based on a charter or a license from the king. But it looks a little bit different than government in Virginia. For one, each town was governed by the male church members. Every town would choose somebody from the town to be a member of the General Court in Boston. The General Court was kind of like the House of Burgesses down in Virginia. It wrote the laws for the colony. At first, the General Court would select somebody to be the governor, but eventually, all of the male church members got to vote on who the governor would be. And that governor would serve for a year. And then there would be new elections. Sometimes these Puritan towns would become a little bit too crowded. And if that happened, any group of settlers could get together and apply to the General Court to set up their own town. You had to have 20 families, at least, and you had to have a Puritan minister because every town had to have a church. And if your request got approved, you could get a large piece of land. Then the townspeople would get to decide how to split that land up. And they could distribute it any way they liked. Now this idea of a town and new towns popping up is important. Because for our third part, we're going to talk about life in Massachusetts. And life in Massachusetts was really centered on the town. So you had towns like the picture here of Deerfield, Massachusetts, which is just around Boston. Lots of little towns popping up. And the town was the center of life. Everybody was part of a town. It wasn't like in Virginia where you had huge farms and everybody lived spread out. Everyone was part of a town. If a town got big enough and you had more than 50 families, you were required to build a school, and it had to be free. Male church members ran these towns through regular town meetings. And at these town meetings, which would be held in buildings like the picture here, a meeting house, which sometimes might also be a church or it might just be a house, meeting house by itself. But at these meetings, every eligible male church member could stand up and participate. They could speak out about the important issues facing the town. They could choose officials to run the town. They voted on taxes and laws for the town. They decided how the land would be given out. And they provided for a church, right? To build a church and to take care of the minister. Every citizen was expected to help. And that was men, women, children. You could help different ways. Some people could help by building fences or helping repair roads or other things that were broken. Others, men in particular, were expected to pitch in and defend the town from threats, particularly from the natives. And that's, we get this idea of the Minuteman, which is going to be important in the Revolution, from this idea that everybody pitched in to help defend the town. And people who were not Puritans could live in these towns in Massachusetts, but the towns were really centered around the Puritan religion, right? Because Massachusetts was started as a colony for religious freedom for Puritans. So you could live there if you weren't Puritan, but you couldn't vote, and you couldn't hold office, right? So there were some restrictions there. Fill in your notes as best you can. Go back and rewatch parts of the video as needed. And we will discuss any questions or things that are confusing at our next class period.